terra. Nossa terra. A terra é nossa casa. O interessante é que ela produz tudo o que necessitamos para viver com o outro e para o outro. Contudo, não estamos cuidando dela, nem de seus moradores. A terra está sendo destruída. Nossa terra. Eu sinto. Minha terra. Observe as consequências das mudanças climáticas. Enchentes, tsunamis, terremotos em lugares inimagináveis. E o que dizer da falta de alimentos para prover comida para mais de 7 bilhões de pessoas dessa casa? Eu sinto. Eu me sinto. Eu me sinto em minha terra. Como prover energia e água potável de forma igualitária? Como cuidar dos vulneráveis e discriminados? Como promover o desenvolvimento sustentável em todos os cantos de nossa terra? Nossa terra. Nossa terra. Terra. Minha terra. Eu sinto. Eu me sinto. Eu me sinto em minha terra. Terra. nossa Terra.
We are live. Have a great conference.
Bom dia.
Good morning. Welcome, everyone. We are here today on the third and last, seventh conference day for social environmental accounting, an excellent event organized by Professor Araceli Pereira from the University of Rio de Janeiro, Araceli de Rosa from Santa Catarina Federal University, Fátima Rosa from the University of Brasilia, and among all these women, Marcela Noche from São João do Rei, Minas Gerais. Thank you very much for the invitation to organize these speakers to talk about the importance of ESG, which considers environmental, governance, and social factors with decision making. My name is Viviane Torinelli, and in the name of the organizing committee, I'd like to thank Professor Luluk from Indonesia University. Thank you very much.
It's an honor and a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Also, José Alexandre Vasco, Superintendent of CVM, the real estate organization. Thank you so much for being with us in the debate today. José Vasco is Superintendent of CVM for the protection of the investment from 2017. He's been working as a focal point with CVM with the lab. Currently, he started presenting with sustainable centers. He is the chairman of International Organization of Security Commissions, and he represents CVM in the Sustainable Finance Task Force, which was launched in 2020, having integrated the steering group of Sustainable Finance Network. He is a bachelor and master's in law from the University of Rio de Janeiro. He has a master's in finance and capital markets. And Professor Luluk is a senior lecturer at the University of Indonesia. Her research focuses on the role of environmental, social, and governance information within the responsible investments market. She completed her PhD in environmental finance at the University of Queensland and a postdoctoral fellowship at the Centre for Corporate Sustainability and Environmental Finance at Macquarie University, Australia. She has worked in projects and workshops in the field of sustainability reporting, environmental cost-benefit analysis, and social entrepreneurship in collaboration with various multinational organizations in Southeast Asia. Myself will be the moderator. My name is Viviane Torinelli. I'm the co-founder of BRASFI, Sustainable Research, and I invite you to have a look at BRASFI if you want to learn a little bit more. I was part of the research and the UK initiatives for research of Brazilian sustainable finances, which happens within the Corporation of Brazil, Germany. I'm part of the climate change board in Salvador. I hope my PhD is towards the end and looking at environmental impacts. I've been working for 20 years in risk management, control, and behavior conformity in the private sector. This will be broadcasted in two different channels, one in English and one in Portuguese. The event has simultaneous interpretation in real time. If you're in Zoom, you have to choose the channel in which you hear at the bottom of the page. You can choose there whether you like English, Portuguese, or switch off the interpreting to be able to hear the original language. In YouTube, the links are different. If you go to the conference website, you can pick the one you need. It's just to go into www.csca.net.br and you can choose the links. Today, 30th of June, first reference will be this event, and from there you can go into the link you need. First of all, we will have a presentation from Professor Luluk from the University of Indonesia, And in sequence, we will hear Superintendent of CVM, Professor Alexandre Vasco. Towards the end, we will have time for debate, and questions can be registered here or in Zoom in the chat, and also can be posted on our YouTube chat, and we will convey them. I think that's the event. And now, Professor Luluk, the floor is yours. We wish you all a wonderful event.
Share your screen and start your presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Viviane, and thank you, everyone. So obviously, thank you to the CSCA committee for giving me the opportunity to share my paper today. So hello, everyone. Hopefully, it will be a quite interesting session today. So today, I will share my paper. It is about the socially responsible investment and the environmental, social, and governance metrics, which is my paper, which is a systematic literature review. So before we move to my paper, just want to clarify what is SRI. So there are many terminology that have been used. Some of them might be familiar to some of you. So other terminology that are used are responsible investment, sustainable investment, ethical investment, and some also use ESG investment. So there are quite many terminology being used, which represent the diversity of conceptual knowledge and conceptual understanding about SRI. But in this case, we're just going to refer to the definition of responsible investment by the UNPRI, which is the strategy and practice to incorporate environmental, social, and governance factors in the investment decisions and active ownership. So we almost all of us know, obviously, when we talk about the ESG or investment or SRI, all the advocates suggest that this is a tool that aims to encourage companies to be more sustainable. We try to support and we try to promote more sustainable corporate behaviors. And we also know that based on the growth over the past decade, it has seen rapid growth and it has seen quite a lot of interest, as can be seen from the growth of the investment value itself here. So in terms of the SRI, one of the important factors that we have to consider is the ESG information, because obviously we need all the ESG information in order to make decisions on SRI. So who are the information providers? So this is just a compilations that I have over the past year. So hopefully this is still the most recent ones. So as of now, this is probably the 7 biggest information provider for ESG information. Some of them might be familiar to you, as they are also, information providers that has been used by investors for other type of information, such as the MSCI, Revenue, Bloomberg, and also S&P. Some of them might not be as familiar, as they are specialized in ESG, such as Sustainalytics and Vigeo Eiris, and also ISS, even though all 3 of them are currently affiliated with big conventional information provider as well. So this is just to show you the diversity of provider of the information provider that we have for ESG information. And all of them provide slightly different methodology, slightly different coverage, slightly different products as well. So we will see later on how the diversity of this ESG rating agency affect the development of the market. So just to introduce you, what is the definition of SRI and who are the information provider of ESG information. So now maybe in regard to SRI itself, there are quite a few strategies. Some of them might be more familiar, which is the screening, which can be said to be the earliest method of the ESG investment. This is, I refer to the definition by the UNPRI and also the GSIR about the compilation of approaches available for SRI, or what are considered as SRI. So it can be ESG incorporations, which includes integrations of ESG factors in many ways, but can also include the screening, either the exclusionary, you exclude certain companies because of ESG performance, or you choose certain company because of certain ESG performance, or based on certain norms that has been agreed by your clients or your investors, but also some thematic investment as well. While the other method that also recognized is this active ownership, which can include the proxy votings, or another terms being used is shareholders activism, or also engagement directly with the company. So those are just introduction to the market and ESG informations. But what about the paper itself? So this paper is built by the concern about the diversity of the conceptual understanding of SRI. What constitutes SRI? How does it develop? And what are actually being discussed by academics, by the literature about SRI? But we also want to know what actually the role of ESG metrics, because we understand instinctively that ESG metrics or ESG informations or ESG score or measure are inseparable. It's important. It's the foundations. Then there are questions abroad, a lot of questions remains on the quality of these informations. But we haven't really seen any discussions about what actually the role. Is it just a measure? Or does it serve another role? What can it be used for? So that's actually the objective of the paper. So by doing this paper, we hope to have quite of a map of the discourse, the discussion of SRI within the literature, and we try to identify the roles of ESG metrics within the SRI market itself. So how do we try to do it? We try to do a systematic review. By doing a review based on a systematic way, we try to be really organized in looking at the literature. So we look at the search terms that being used, that's generally being used to search about literature in SRI. We look at the parameters, and also we look at some other criteria, which obviously resulted in 634 articles, which we analyzed. So we might not be able to fully read the whole papers, but we try to identify the influential articles and have analysis of the influential articles within this field. So again, we have another cleaning. We try to eliminate literature that is not actually relevant. And we, based on those, we find the final articles that we analyze, which are actually 429 articles. And out of these articles, we try to have visualizations to help us with the mapping of the discourse. And we try to also do the content analysis to find similarities and differences in terms of themes. So before we move toward the themes, which is probably the more interesting part, is just to show you the numbers. Obviously, some of you are academics in this field, so you might want to know which journals or which publication is actually the most significant, has the most impact. So just based on the number itself, we see the publication of SRI has increased significantly over the years, and even after 2016, we see continuous increase. And out of those publications, we found that many of them, we found that actually 112 have been published in a certain journal, which is Journal of Business Ethics. And interestingly, Journal of Banking and Finance, which is a conventional journal in finance, has also published quite a lot of paper in SRI. So this is just a list of journals that you might want to look up to if you are interested to read a bit more about SRI and also about ESG investment in general. But based on this, if you want to know who actually has the highest impact, it is actually all the conventional finance journal, which is the Financial Analysis Journal, the Journal of Financial Research, Review of Financial Economics, just by looking at how many citations that they have. It's just to show us what kind of theme that might be popular, because obviously when we talk about conventional finance journal, they might be talking more about performance and other type of financial concerns. But if you want to look at what paper is actually become the highest cited based on this collection that we have, we found that the journal by Bauer is the one that has the highest citations by 105 other papers in the collections, which obviously the paper talking about, as the title said, about the performance of the SRI. So as we can see here, if you are again interested to have a read a little bit more about paper in SRI, my suggestion is maybe have a read on this highly influential paper just to see how they set the standards for papers in SRI field. So based on this paper, we try to dig deeper to see what are the papers, what they discussed, what are the themes that appears in the literature, and we found, based on the software that we use, we found this mapping, which is a visualizations of the theme. So you have the blue here that represent the papers that talk about the performance, the financial performance of SRI. We have the green ones, all the papers that talk about the development of the SRI. And we have the orange one, which talk about the behavior of the investors of SRI. So obviously, this is based on our analysis on the similarities and differences of the papers that we analyzed. And we, in this map, we only analyze the influential articles, means that articles that have been cited by more than 15 papers. So we just want to see what are the main discussions that occurs. So based on those, we look at, again, in detail of about what is actually discussed in each theme. So for example, for the investors' behavior theme, we found that many of the paper talk about the demographic side. So who are the ESG investors? So researchers have attempted to identify the ESG investors by looking at demographic characteristics such as age, education, gender, income, and political view. And these studies have found that the SRI is of interest or being popular for certain demographic groups. For example, it's popular for young to middle age, for the university educated, for female, interestingly, and also for middle income professionals. And if you look into the political view, it is more popular for those people who has liberal, more on a liberal view in the political spectrum. This is probably more on the US political spectrum, if we may say so. But this characteristic might not necessarily decide why they're doing it. So the studies also looking at the motivation behind it. The studies found that, yes, some investors have the altruistic or ethical reason. They want to be social. They want to be responsible. Interestingly, those investors also have this more business-oriented motivation as well. And what being found by the studies is that majority of the investors actually have both motivations. So yes, they do want to be ethical, but they also still consider their value, their return that they will get. It is the balance between both motivation that differs between different investors. And that's what the studies found. And how does these investors behave? So interestingly, again, most investors will actually invest in both ESG and also conventional investment. So it is quite rare to have investors that only have ESG. So they usually combine their ESG portfolio with their other conventional type of investment. It might be in sort of a short-term investment, and they also have a ESG portfolio. But the thing is, these investors are usually more resilient toward negative results. So they're usually keeping their portfolio even if they have negative results. Then this is just to show them maybe that the ESG investors are a little bit more loyal toward their portfolio. Maybe their ethical reasoning, their altruistic value actually affect their decisions to stay within the fund or within their ESG investment, even if they maybe have to deal with negative return for a certain period. But also, if we see majority of ESG at this moment are institutional investors, pension funds and other big investments such as BlackRock and so on. So, but then how does the behavior of the individual investors, you, me, everyone, right? How does our behavior actually have an impact toward the decisions by a big institutional investors? I assume we also have pension funds and such. So how does the effect of individual investors affect the institutional investors? So that's one of the themes that has been discussed, but still has more opportunity to be researched further. But also, if we talk about the other theme, about the development of the market, so many papers try to see historically what happened in the USA, what happened in Canada or North America, but what happened in Europe and Australia, because arguably those markets are more advanced in terms of SRI market, and they try to see what factors that actually affect those development. Many also looking at how the market, especially in those regions, in those countries, are able to bring the ESG investment and ESG discussion in general into the mainstream discussions. Right. So what are the, whether ESG is a mainstream issue, that's actually a question, but they also look at what are the challenges and opportunities that this market have faced in the past or maybe still now in regard to bringing ESG investment into the mainstream. But we also look at some issues that came up due to heterogeneity, due to the diversity of the approaches, because the problem is one approach that is claimed to be SRI might not be claimed by as an SRI by other investors. So there might be different interpretation of what constitute as SRI, of what constitute as ESG investment. So that can be a challenge and also opportunity as well. But if we look at the factors, that influence the development of this market, they found several factors. The first is the advocates, the existence of these advocates. So the active involvement of ESG advocates, it can be non-government organizations, it can be academics, it can be even some regulators. So these ESG advocates serve this as an advisors, as a consultant, and also as a sort of a support system for investors who want to get to know ESG, who want to find information, and we want to maybe make sure that confirm that what they're doing is actually ESG. So the importance of advocate is really significant in the development of ESG market. The other important factors is the availability and quality of the ESG information and also, of course, the ESG metrics. So the high quality ESG information is essential to ensure that the investors have confidence on what they're actually doing, that the investors can actually translate their values, their environmental values, their social values into a true and accurate investment decisions in terms of their ESG investments. But in order to do all of this, we need regulations, we need clear support, clear policy support from the government, from the authority in order to create boundaries, in order to create the maybe some reward and punishment and some incentives for the advocates, also for the improvement of ESG information quality as well. But also important to create awareness. Why? Because SRI is more likely a demand-led market. So it is important to also increase the demand, to also increase the awareness of people that this is something that can be done. It is possible to blend your financial and your social values, something like that. But then what is the majority of the discussions? Again, the majority of the discussion is all about performance. Unfortunately, many academics are more interested in the performance of the SRI, and the way they look at the performance, obviously they look at the return, but they also look at the fund flow. And the approach that these studies have done is by comparing the portfolio of ESG investment versus the comparable conventional investment, or by making a hypothetical portfolio and then comparing the portfolio with the high ESG performance versus the performance of portfolio with the low ESG score. So that's the general approach that's being done. And the result, yes, some have negative, some have positive, but the more interesting result is the mixed one, because it shows how contextual the result of your portfolio can be. In different situations, maybe in this case, when the market is not good in general, maybe they'll have different sort of result, and what happened if different market situation, what will be the ESG performance, or maybe it will be differs based on the strategy being implemented by the mutual funds, for example, whether they use negative screening or positive screening, that can have an effect toward the performance itself. So for example, this is just an example if you are interested to see that if we look at even the same context, for example, even when we look at the mutual funds, yes, we know that there are majority of the studies that found no significant difference, but there are studies that find both positive and negative impact. But some also find, again, multi-impact. It can be negative, it can be positive, depends on. Even if you look at the approach, or even if you look at the model, obviously in finance, you're already familiar with some of the model, CAPM or multi-factor regressions, or even if they combine both, they do have different results. So you might argue, yeah, but we have more result with no significant difference. Yes, but again, quantity doesn't signify general consensus, right? So there should be, in a way, the conclusion is that there is not yet a general consensus. And what's currently being proposed out there is that the performance effect can differs. It is very contextual. So that's basically about the discourse that we have in the literature about SRI. But if you look deeper again, the other objective of this paper is to see the roles of this ESG information, of ESG metrics. So it differs. In the early days of the SRI, the majority of the SRI investors use negative screening method. In order to serve that methodology, the binary code, most of you might be familiar with KLD, the one that use a 1 versus 0, yes or no, basically, might be sufficient, basically, when they say whether the company actually involved in or maybe some controversial industry, yes or no, that might be enough for a negative screening method. But when new method become popular, which is positive screening, then the metrics have to evolve to be more on the scoring model, so that we will be able to see the best in class for that industry in terms of ESG performance. So the evolution of ESG metrics sort of evolve in the same direction with the popularity of certain methodology. While doing so, the one that currently being used is mainly the raw ESG score. So if from the 7 big information provider that I mentioned before, all of them provide scores. Some of them provide rating. Some of them provide ranking. So majority of the studies use directly these scores, this ranking or ratings. Some also use index, which obviously we know about Dow Jones Sustainability Index or FTSE for Good, or in Brazil, I understand you have ICE, ISE, my apology. So that can be, that was used as well by some of the papers. Some also use mutual funds, which is basically just a processed ESG metrics. But with the mutual funds, the issue is that we don't really know how the mutual funds actually utilize the ESG ratings. But the issue with ESG metrics as a proxy is that we don't really actually know the methodologies. There is lack of transparency in regard to methodologies implemented by these ESG rating agencies, by these ESG providers. Yes, they might provide us with certain disclosure about their methodology, but we cannot say, oh, we don't really know 100% on how they actually came up with a score. Maybe we know the indicators being used, but we don't know the weight for each indicators. There also lack of consistency between the ESG ratings. There's lack of standardizations in regard to ESG information. Which one is actually important? Which one that needs to be included? Which one that may not need to be included? So there is lack of standardization. So this become a concern for the ESG investors and for the academics as well. But interestingly, we found that many studies has also found the importance of ESG metrics for the development of the market. So in order for us to have a good ESG or good SRI market, we need ESG metrics, right? Because when we want to establish ESG market or SRI market, the ESG metrics provide legitimacy. It translates the value, the social value, the environmental value into some sort of quantitative numbers that is familiar, the language that is familiar for financial analysts, for investors, for those involved in financial sectors. So it provides legitimacy that this approach is feasible, this is a legit approach and robust until a way. But also we found, some papers found that the growth of the market, SRI market, especially in the UK and in France, have actually accelerated significantly after the establishment of the ESG rating agency in that market. So it became the accelerant for the growth of the market. But in terms of advocacy, it is also a good educational tools to introduce, to show that yes, we have an objective and up to a certain point, robust methodology to actually measure ESG performance. But again, there are quite a lot of improvements that needs to be made. So that's actually the papers is all about. And if you just want to look at the key findings, we found that within the literature, it's dominated by the questions about what is the financial performance about SRI. But we haven't actually known much about whether actually SRI have effect toward the corporate behavior. It is not something that has been widely researched. What is the real behavioral impact of SRI? Does it actually fulfill or achieve its main objective to actually change corporate behavior. Also, there is a lack of discussions between the literature of different themes. But also maybe two things that, or one thing that I want to focus here is the quality and reliability of ESG metrics that still needs to be improved. So based on these key findings, if you look at what can be done in the future for research, in this case, these are the opportunities that I can suggest based on the paper. For example, maybe if we want to look at the belief system in a more qualitative research on the belief system underpin the behavior. If we want to look at more on the financial performance, maybe we want to look at the financial performance of the other strategy of SRI, which is the shareholder activism. Or in our case, if we talk about Indonesia and Brazil, how does SRI in emerging economies? What can be done based on what we can learn from those developed markets? And that's actually the end of my presentations. Hopefully it is useful and looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Luluk, for your excellent presentation, and congratulations for your very interesting paper. In your work and presentation, thank you. In your work and presentation, we saw regulation among the factors that influence the development of the ESG market, besides advocates, ESG metrics, and awareness, isn't it? So in this context, we would like to listen to Vasco from the Brazilian Securities Exchange Commission. And at the end, we will have our Q&A session, okay? Vasco, muito obrigada por permanecer aqui conosco.
Thank you very much for being here with us. Professor Luluk's presentation really opens the way, the path to talk about reports and incorporating the ESG factors. And this discussion has its challenges, of course, along this way of the risks and the challenges, but it will be wonderful to hear you from a perspective of a regulator, from the public sector, and closely to the market. Vasco, please, the floor is yours to make your comments, and towards the end, we will have a debate. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I thank, in the name of CVM, for the invitation to this panel to share the debate with the experience of Professor Luluk. I think it was a really interesting exposition. And for us regulators who are dealing with themes that have traditional protection of the investor, protection of information, are in the DNA of the performance of a regulator. And this already also has worries with potential investments and so forth, but these are traditional problems that raise new challenges and opportunities when we talk about sustainable investment. These challenges have to, for regulators. So I think it's very important, the debate and the opportunity of dialoguing between regulation and research, academia, which has a lot to contribute to us as regulators. What we're living at the moment is a moment, I've been here for 15 years at CVM as a superintendent in this area, dealing with education, with protection, and recently, 4 years ago, with sustainability. I think that we can say that we are living a convergence moment of different things that come together when it comes to markets, but also for regulation. I won't say that it's something like a scientific revolution, but that has a structure of its own. It's not the case. But we are living a moment that is very interesting, that has a lot of study and innovation, and it's different from science that has a lot to be considered by regulators. It's not always possible to perceive the degree of change that we are going through at the moment. How are the structures changing? And up until recently, I'm convinced that we're living precisely that moment where there is a unique government situation, the regulators, international responsible individuals for establishing International Organization of Service Commission and other international organizations from the central bank. All of these changes have made the society perceive that the financial system is a tool, is a channel to help in the sustainable development. I think this happens, it's only in its beginnings, for reasons that were, when Luluk was talking about her research, changing mentality, changing culture, creating bridges between an environmental view, which is usually just a style. Sometimes people don't understand how that impacts the market or how it's important for the market, but also a change, a shift in cultural perspectives from the population itself. Investors, how do they make those decisions? This change happens more in new generations, especially in millennial population. Research shows that there is a growing interest for information and social impact and the sense of investments or what they mean, and also different stakeholders. So clearly, the financial sector has a crucial role in delineating this transition for a more sustainable world. With this vision, the CVM, the Security and Exchange Commission, created a sustainable task force to develop a proposal for acting where we have 95% of the market regulated, and so this initiative, sustainable investment, and this task force, I'll share with you a little bit about it, was designed thinking about three main areas. The first, the issue of disclosure, information disclosure for the corporate, for the real estate sectors, how the organization needs to be shared, how the information needs to be put forward to stakeholders and so forth. The other front is the one that's being developed in relation to resources and how to deal with the protection of investment, especially when it comes to greenwashing. And the third front is focused on the relationship with the data providers. These information providers are so important. This is very much linked to the traditional mandate of a regulator. When you talk about capital markets and so forth, has three aims: the protection of the investors, and in that sense, these principles that are accepted for regulators for IOSCO regulated markets reinforces the importance that there needs to exist from 2016 these principles and information that is up to date and complete on financial results and any other financial information, even risks that are important in their materials to decide, for investors to decide. So in the case of those tools for collective investment, like investment flux and so forth, this is principle 26 of IOSCO, and they established that all information that is material for the assessment of a collective investment tool has to be available for the investors, but also for potential investors in an opportune way. Framework from regulation has to exist in a guaranteed manner so that they receive material information in a continuous way as a means to increase the protection of the investor and to promote transparent and efficient markets, which is the aim of the markets for regulators. So information that is of disclosure
from the point of view of finances, but also from the point of view of sustainability that is relevant, that is useful and is consistent for investment. IOSCO then, from 2018, started doing a series of initiatives, launching initially a group of emerging markets that produced in 2019 a report that presents the importance of sustainable finance for emerging markets and the role that the regulators need to have. In April of 2020, IOSCO, through the Sustainable Finance Network, published a report for regulators from information of IOSCO, talking about the actual performance of the regulators. I'll talk about this in a little bit. Why is this so important then for regulators in securities markets and so on? If this is from 2018 such an important role of IOSCO, fundamentally because the transition to financial sustainable models and the mitigation of risks in climate change go necessarily through the financial system. There are financial impacts of climate change and also a series of risks related to these changes, whether it be in governance or impact of the companies on society, that needs to be presented to investors in a way in which they can make decisions in an informed way. At the same time, if this dimension that points to the need of disclosure, even of the risks, the governance of the risk and so forth, of the capital, but then the transition of a more sustainable model presents a series of opportunities, especially for emerging markets, in a way that many emitters, many companies move to this disclosure of information, and they see it as an opportunity. I was talking about a perspective from an emerging market, Brazil, Indonesia, of course, markets that have dynamic capital growing. This is an important topic. In the case of Brazil, an estimate of a few years ago reached to 1.3 trillion investment in the Brazilian infrastructure to make it more consistent with the needs of the sustainable development for Brazil. These resources will not leave the public investment, and they need to. The private sector also needs it, but they will stay in the public sector. And this is important for financial sustainable investment. And they need to attend to the demands of the society, of related to health and related to other issues. What does this report of IOSCO focused on these emerging markets assessed? First of all, that there would be a great opportunity for the emerging countries to promote sustainable development for financial systems, so that if they develop this methodology, would be sort of friendlier to investment, so to speak, and investors, if they had this sustainable investment opportunity. So it would be important to create an ecosystem that would facilitate these financial sustainable investments that would go through, of course, regulation, sort of regulative structure, and through, of course, disclosure and regulations by a series of patterns of protection for the investor, and mechanism that can understand how important it is for the investors. This is the task. This task force pointed to 10 recommendations for emerging markets, specifically on disclosure information. The first recommendation for regulators was to specific risks, and at the same time
opportunity to invest to the different markets. These informations relative to the risks and the opportunities could be part of a regulation of a regulative structure for disclosure applied to the country. Regulators also should worry about the quality of the data relative to the report of factors ESG. This information is not just then providing the information, but the information, of course, has to be of quality. Sometimes they could be misleading if they're not of quality. In 2019, then, there were various investors from small markets. And what did we hear? We heard from the market itself that there is a need in 2019, this is, to have comparable data and to have a structure that be consistent and clear so that the investors could make their decisions on investment in an adequate manner, in a well-informed manner. One of the problems was lack of standards, globally accepted as one of the problems for development, one of the hurdles, so to speak. So there was then a need, there was seen a need to have sustainable, consistent taxonomies that would come to be implemented to facilitate this analysis for investors, especially institutional investors, which have a great role and a potential for development for a market of sustainable finance. They requested that we act to provide more transparency for that information and improve the quality of information for ESG. Information is not always of good quality. There are serious deficiencies, and sometimes these deficiencies are determined or caused by the lack of regulation, of compulsory regulation that establishes compulsorily what are the standards that need to be followed. Apart from that, from the problem of compulsory, making compulsory the supply of this information, the other problem was the comparing issue for international investors in particular, who invest in different markets. How do they compare markets? How do they compare data to make a decision of investment that is consistent with the mandates that those institutional investors need to follow? So we launched the Sustainable Finance Network that did a great research in 2019, mapping the initiatives of the regulators, the initiatives also of the markets, to have a better understanding of why and how regulators are dealing with things related to sustainability. Another arm of this initiative of the Sustainable Financing Network was a focus on the dialogue, because it was pointed out the problem of comparability, the problem of multiple taxonomies, which in fact brought difficulties in development of the market. And we tabled a number of initiatives to discuss with standard setters on the possibilities of those methodologies, on those to work and improve the deficiencies pointed out by investors and by participants in the market. What does this research show to us? I participated of the Sustainable Finance Network and the steering group as well, led by CVM, which the Sustainable Financial Task Force. Regulators pointed out that there were issues, especially one of them, perhaps number one of the list for emerging markets, is that climate change presents risk, in particular financial risks, and those risks are not adequately represented in the disclosure in different jurisdictions. This is linked to disclosure, that these informations
of materiality, and especially on risk management, is a key element so that markets can develop. And so there was a need, a greater need for precision in regulation and in the providing of that information. It was also identified that many regulators, especially markets that are already developed, were already giving steps towards ensuring that the market would consider ESG parameters in their financial activity, in their strategies, and when it comes to identity, and also report the risks for the investors to know and for stakeholders to be aware of. 75% of regulators signaled that they were already in some way involved with local initiatives to promote sustainable finance, to have discussions and thinking about the issue in a unanimous way, recognizing that sustainability would be very important for the development of their markets. Unfortunately, various regulators didn't have a legal mandate, so the competency to regulate the issue and generate, and they used a competency that they had in a general manner, but nothing specific to sustainable financing. In relation, which I think is interesting to point out, not to talk about only from the perspective of a regulator, 130 repliers around the world, asset managers, market participants, companies that do rating of ESG answered in a unanimous way almost that there was a role for regulators, and that role is to promote transparency and prevent greenwashing, mainly for us, for regulators. 65% of the people who answered from 130 said that there was a need for a convergence of results, whether it be through regulatory measures, regulatory coordination by different regulators around the world, be it through solutions based on markets, so a combination of solutions. So the conclusion of the report was that there is a great demand of investors in relation to companies, to firms, and also in relation to asset managers, so that information on sustainable financing would be available and promoted for investors. And many stakeholders indicated that there was a lack of comparability between information related to climate and information on ESG factors. And that was really the main problem. So 3 conclusions then as topics, as unanimous topics that really directed our work was to work to face the problem of multiple and diverse standards for sustainability. So we should have a role to stimulate a work there to have convergence. Another problem related is the lack of definitions, common definitions of what are sustainable activities, and that's important to have those definitions, and they need to be delineated. What's greenwashing and the protection of the investor are great areas of worry for the entire market, because it's natural to popularize green, social, or sustainable investments. The lack of criteria, of methodology, could generate a great problem of greenwashing and protection of investors, affecting even the trust of the investors on the market. So it was created a task force, a mandate to promote
two main aims identified through this report, through this the work of this network, to straighten issues of transparency and to promote the protection of the investor. This task force was greatly engaged by investors, and the reports have been published. Even to now, in the month of June, 2 reports today were published on the role of asset managers, and it was open for consultation. But what does this work done by the task force indicated? That asset managers are really looking for information that are comparable, complete, and consistent, that there is a lack of an international coordination, that it's important to have a need for specific standards for each industry that are more adequate. And they give great value to a mix of information, quantitative metric, but also qualitative information on these investments. And the challenge is to be able to compare. There was also an assessment of current data on the report of corporations around the world in a general manner. We identified various areas of minority, and here we're talking about the global scene, not specific markets. But in general, investors, asset managers understand that the information is not complete, is not consistent, and is not comparable. It's not a positive scenario for the development of finance that is sustainable. Companies many times select the standard based on what their interest is, based on what they do, their specificity. So a way to choose might be the standard that is perhaps more adequate for that company, which makes comparability difficult, of course. There's also the challenge of the fact that information of disclosure of companies look to straighten and to engage different stakeholders, whether it's government or providers or employers, consumers, and also investors. And those companies look to do a mix of qualitative information and also quantitative information, but when the quantitative information is given in a limited way and in an inconsistent way. In general, companies don't provide information that is detailed on the impact of their own practices in relation to sustainability and their performance. And so that information, in fact, is not presented in an adequate manner, and that is a problem globally. What do we do then? I don't think this is being clearly perceived, but it will change the way in which emitters will provide information in the next years. We launched, through the Sustainable Finance Task Force, a coordinated effort with different owners of taxonomies to promote convergence. Perhaps the result that had most impact, and that speaks very well on this conference, was the articulation with the International Financial Reporting Standards, to establish an international sustainability standard support. That new board focused on sustainability standards will be next to the traditional one, the Accountant Standards Board. And that effort was encouraged by IOSCO, which designed together with ARFS Foundation a roadmap so that those changes are implemented. IOSCO worked with the other foundation, and we are working to prepare that change. We will have a launch of the new board to have that kind of information. So these are 3 main lines of ways to act. The first one is to establish a governance that is very strong of this foundation. And the idea is that in November of this year already we are established. Then from the establishment of this board to create and start to build as building blocks to design a global baseline for information in a way that until June of 2022, these standards, this basic standard is established and can be adopted by IOSCO, can be supported by IOSCO, can be supported. There's 95% of regulators of markets today. In the sequence, then encourage the graduate build of new and standard complements. The other point where IOSCO operates and continues to work is so that emitters can provide adequate information on ESG factors at different levels. So the issue of straightening the environmental, social materiality from the financial one and to work that theme, sometimes there's overlapping between both and information that can make it difficult for investors to understand, especially taking into account the dynamic of this materiality that changes all the time. So it's factors that are not material and then become material in a horizon that is a little bit longer time. IOSCO foresees here priority areas to straighten the needs for investors. And I'll cite here just a few of the areas. The first one is the need of investors to have information that is complete, consistent, and comparable. And that means disclosure regulation that is adequate with an international pattern. In that sense, IOSCO will encourage the establishment of global standards, consistent standards. It will also consider the difficulties of having a mix of qualitative and qualitative information, because it's not always, the quantitative information is not always given fully, but we will promote an effort to establish comparable metrics and how to report that information in a qualitative way. And it will act also, considering that it's a global way, to coordinate the different markets in the world. This structure then of building blocks will come first, will focus first on the disclosure of information that is financially material for investors, focusing on the first block of orientations, and then in the second block of orientations of guidance, guidelines, information that is more focused for the different stakeholders and not just for a need of information for investors. So, concluding my speech and moving to Brazil, we did research here, CVM, through the Innovation Lab, which CVM launched with the IDB. This is in 265 institutions, and we had 700 representatives. So looking at all the work, we assessed how companies are reporting the information on that are mandatory. Of course, there are many findings that were favorable. There were companies without worry of informing, of disclosing issues that we saw outside, but to make the information in an organized way, then the information, ECG information was reported. It's a qualitative assessment, and many times they don't have the quantitative information. Sometimes there was a lack of consistency, but great part of the companies do look to adopt international patterns when they disclose their information, but they don't identify the same worry on the drafting of the reports. So there is a lack of metric, and that makes it difficult to be precise when it comes to that information, even though a great part of companies in Brazil use the information we provide at CVN on sustainability. Many documents have very little information on ESG, and they lack depth, considering information that was available as reference, sometimes in a general way. So what did we do at CVM in this sense? We started a series of regulatory reforms. The main guideline, the main rule is that how the disclosure of information needs to be done. We had a public audience review that was open to comments by the population, bringing an improvement of the information for environmental and social and governance related issues. Of course, there is information on impact. When it has to do with costs, the company would have to report more information, but that was balanced, of course, with the elimination of some information in some fields that were perceived as not being relevant for investors. So there were some changes that were put forward to this public review. They received comments, and CVM proposed a matrix of materiality for the emitters to indicate whether the sustainable reports was appropriate and which elements worked, whether or not it considers the aims of sustainable development. And if they didn't inform ESG, they would have to explain why they're not doing so. Also, talking about general information, talking about risk factors, social risk factor, environmental and climate risk factors as a category aside, precisely to guarantee better transparency on each one of those factors. And I can also mention here that the channels, the admin structure, so what are the channels through which ESG issues arrive to the knowledge of the Administration Council? We've seen last year diversity in task force becomes something that we need to pay attention to. And if we leave it as that, it will bring much more precision into the information. The review, of course, is not it. There's more work to be done. But it signaled that we may adopt these changes in regulation to have better information in the near future. That would be positive. I think that this work of the CVM in relation to the theme today complements a little bit what I discussed in terms of international markets. And this is my comment. I'm open to questions and comments. Thank you. Thank you very much, Vasco. The chat is full of questions. So what I want to suggest, the first question that Professor Araceli put forward, I'll come back to you. I'll ask a question to Professor Luluk first.
To start our debate, First, we have a question from Professor Araceli Ferreira. She rescued that among the results of your research are the mixed findings where ESG has no significant impact on the financial results. Based on that, please, in your opinion, could the ESG influence financial performance or not? Thank you, Professor.
Okay, thank you, Viviane. So based on the studies, basically what they found is that there is no effect about the ESG strategy. So the comparable result between the ESG portfolio and the conventional portfolio is pretty much the same in terms of returns and funds flow. That's what the study's result is. But if you ask on my opinion, then basically, if we look deeper into the studies itself, and if we look also at others more recent studies, what we can find it's more on the contextual basis, because there also quite an issue recently raised. It has been discussed before, but recently raised as well about biases that exist on these studies, because obviously when we talk about SRI studies of financial performance of SRI, most of them were based on the data from the US. Quite a few actually based from data from emerging countries or emerging markets, such as Brazil, some countries in Asia as well. So in a way, the reason studies found that it is more contextual. So based on what strategy? So a certain strategy might not necessarily have impact, or even in certain contexts, in certain situations, it might not have impact, but in other situations, it might have impact. More recent studies in the review of financial studies actually compare the performance of the ESG versus conventional portfolio during good times, for example, more on a bullish market, and during sort of a recessions. And they found that ESG does better in the good times, but has more on the lack of performance during the bad times. So it's more contextual. But if we talk about specifically on those studies, in my paper, in my review, that has mixed result or no result, the mixed result is more on the contextual, but the one that has no result, in a way, the interpretation is that it doesn't matter if you choose ESG or if you choose conventional. So we can get a good, the positive interpretations of it is that even if you choose ESG portfolio, it will not affect your return in a way. So you at least it will not have an impact toward your expected return. If we look at a more positive side, it might have a more impact or a higher return. But from those studies, there is no difference on whether you actually choose the ESG portfolio or conventional portfolio. So yeah, if you have a social value, then choose ESG. That's what we can say, because at least it has no impact.
Great. Thank you, Luluk. Vasco, would you like to add something on the top of that? Or por favor, você gostaria de comentar algo ou melhor a gente endereçar?
Would you like us to say something, or would you like to address other questions? We have 3 more here. We can carry on?
Thank you, Luluk.
Okay, thank you, Luluk.
Questions to Vasco, okay? Vasco, a professora Fabrícia Rosa, ela coloca para a gente também.
Professor Fabrícia Rosa say congrats for you both for the excellent presentation and speech. And she says, to maximize the profits, do you think that the environmental profit can be marginal? And what you can do if it's possible to be true? How you can protect the environment? Would you like to share your vision about that? We are in moments of transformation. the regulator, as CVN, applies the international status locally according to the local authorities. So what I'm going to say, it can be subject to change if the Congress changes and establish another turning point. So the regulator will obey the changes required, but the changes required by the societies can become legal changes that I will be talking about that. But so far, the regulator of the capital market is not substitute for the administrator in the decision maker. In judgment role, the companies will choose their strategies. Maybe can be no sustainable strategy. The role of the administrator is to guarantee the information transparency, so can be more comprehensive and open, so the investors will not be mistaken or have the wrong information. So the total is the investor, and it will not take out of consideration the information that is necessary for general stakeholders. So the role of improve the information and have additional requirements in course is our role, but CVN does not substitute for the administrator, and the company have to choose the way to go, how the company will respect the legislation locally and its own business strategy. Of course, when you consider the dimension that the market capital is friendly for sustainable financial, is good for the development of a capital market, CVN is engaged to different stakeholders to promote a dialogue and a change of cultures and transparency. But it's not our legal role to have a company sustainable. But once the company is, it must have a clear report about that. And even though you don't have the competence about environmental and social issues, but the time that the practice is in the role of information to be shared, and if it is not precise, this lack of transparency will be under our jurisdiction and can have a supervision target on the company in question. Thank you, Vasco. In this sense, I would like to point out the disclosure, as you said, about in the center of the discussion in terms of transparency, that is the role of the regulator. David Siasca says and remembers that the CVN promotes through the reference report, this company will disclosure yes or no about the information, and he points out that there are 150 companies, 1/3 informs that has a model of report, social environmental report, and the company is considered as big category. They form that they are not obliged to disclosure. So within this context, with additional information locally speaking, so CVN could contribute, so these companies would contribute and be in compliance with the disclosure of ESG information. It's very important to make it clear that my opinion is not necessarily represent the opinions of the College of CVN that has the last word about the regulation policy of CVN and the technical areas. But myself, I believe that the companies that have a more capacity and size, the regulation is proportional to the information availability, and it will make a distinction in terms of quantity and quality of the information available, not of the type of information made available, but the themes that will be mandatory. In this sense, I understand that all the discussions with the society for the promotion of information that would be appropriate in terms of sustainable finance will motivate that companies that are not obliged in the moment will report as a differential. But it's very important to change and help to change, actually, the mindset of the investor. talking to the issuer of market, they say that 200,000 presentations. This accounting, they had only 4 questions about investors about the subject. So the investors in the retail market, they are not very rigid about this information. They are not very open for having this information. They don't require this type of environmental impact. This is our role to help to change the culture and motivate the companies to have the information with the proportionality. Perfect in your point of view to bring the other side of the table, the discussion as consumers. I think we have not only the company consumers, but the financial products when you choose funds and how you are going to allocate capitals. Can I say something else? We had research with the retail investors that go to crowdfund. 90% of the investors said that would accept to have a less return of investments to be sure that investing in a company that can have a social impact. A small company, so investment is a way of contributing for the purpose. What I want for the planet, to the planet. So the crowdfund investors, at least in this research you did, it is good to see that the majority was seeking for that. And this quality of information is very good, so the investor can keep up investing this type of funds. Perfect, these investments, and to expand the references if you have a pre-qualified information, so you can have investments for impact, like crowdfunding, net funding, and purpose of fundraising with the purpose of impact. Not necessarily it's necessary to have SCD investments to abdicate of return, but you have the purpose as appropriation of a public of investors, and maybe you are not so concerned about return of investments to have really a good impact in the real world. Thank you, Vasco. It makes a lot of sense. You have only 2 minutes to finish this event. Sorry, we had a lot of questions that you could not cover. There is a question from Professor Maísa Ribeiro. Congrats for you too for the excellent speech. And they say that both talked about the difference of compositions of the indicators and frameworks. And she remembers the comparability and the standardizations mentioned by you two. And in this context, comparability is more than necessary, but standardizations could put a limit in the aspect of enhancement if you are not covering the requirements of standardizations. So she would like to hear from you. What do you think about the challenges? This counterpoint between standardizations and comparability. So who is the first one, Professor Luluk or Vasco? You decide.
Okay, I might try. So comparability is necessary, but full standardizations, I think, might not be feasible or might not be fully needed, because Vasco has talked about materiality before, because certain issue might be material for a certain industry, but other might not be for a different industry. So I think it's important to create a balance where it is still comparable, but it is not fully the same. Because obviously we have to consider the context, the nature of the business. And we also, again, we have to consider that we have to keep the ESG information market going on. We have to make the market for ESG information competitive and exist. Obviously, with the current analogy of the credit rating markets, we only have 3 credit rating providers nowadays. So what we expect to happen in the future, hopefully, is that we will have sort of a similar type of ESG information market where we are confident with the quality, we are quite confident with the methodology, it is quite comparable, but it is not fully standardized. They still have their own methodology. In terms of every industry, they also have to consider the nature of their business as well. But again, the comparability at this moment is still need to be improved quite a lot, I think. Maybe Vasco can add to that.
Sim, pensando.
Thinking about that, I understand that we have a beginning of a problem. I agree with the question. What the question brings as a question mark itself, because you have investors, managers, administrators. It's difficult to have a comparability, and there's a loss that you can have, not now, but in the future when the markets grow. You can have a problem of greenwashing, and the reliability is the cement of a capital market. If the reliability is unbalanced, the capital market system suffers. So in this sense, it seems appropriate to have a priority, to set this priority for comparability, consistency of information, the quality of information. This is the first challenge, but I really agree that once you overcome the challenge, you are going to have new challenges coming, and a new wave will be how you can allow a space for additional information. I only point question mark. It's not really a doubt, it's pertinent, but the companies can report anything they want. There is no limitation for that. You can have the entire report, but the researchers say that it's not going on in a consistent manner. So this is the way to have a more standardization, so you can have a flexibility in the future. It's like a pendulum. You go to regulation and you go to standardization, comparability. So it's easier to have the target done. The debate was great, the event, okay, but that's the end of this table. Thank you very much. On behalf of all the organization committee, Professor Vasco, Professor Luluk, Thank you, Luluk. And do you have a final message just to wrap up?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you and excited to see the development of ESG and SRI in Brazil. Hopefully we can learn together. Thank you.
Eu também faço convite.
I invite also, it would be a great time to learn from the experience from Indonesia. And you have the academy, you have the later, and this is an open invitation. The academy can have the scientific revolution. So you are open, new horizons, and then the regulator needs policies based on evidences. And in this sense, we have our area available to the academic, to the professors, to the academy to discuss. Is going to be very positive for all sides and good for the society. Thank you. Thank you, Vasco and Professor Luluk. I'd like to thank you all that are with us, and we're going to see the recording in YouTube. Thank you for the support team, the organization, the information, the translation of the work. Thank you for the translations and for the thank you, translators. And the YouTube CSCA, that is our link, right? The Social Environmental Accountability Congress. So be well, have a wonderful day. Big hug.